commemorating the 39th anniversary of the Beirut Barracks bombing, and we are going to see a video in just a moment of the words that President Ronald Reagan, shared not of his own words, but actually the words of Rabbi Arnold E. Resnicoff. And so before we have this important conversation, we'll turn our attention to the words of President Ronald Reagan.
I remember the first time I jumped in a foxhole, the first time the shells actually fell within the U.S. area. Looking around at the others in there with me, I made the remark that we probably had the only interfaith foxholes in Beirut. The Druze, Muslims, Christians all had theirs. The Jewish forces in the Israeli army had theirs. But we were together. I made the comment then that perhaps if the world had more interfaith foxholes, there might be less of a need for foxholes altogether. To understand the role of the chaplain, Jewish, Catholic, or Protestant, is to understand that we try to remind others, and perhaps ourselves as well, to cling to our humanity even in the worst of times. We bring with us the wisdom of men and women whose faith has kept alive their dreams in ages past. We bring with us the images of what the world could be, of what we ourselves might be, drawn from the visions of prophets and the promises of our holy books. We bring with us the truth that faith not only reminds us of the holy in heaven, but also of the holiness we can create here on earth. It brings not only a message of what is divine, but also of what it means to be truly human. It's too easy to give in to despair in a world sometimes seemingly filled with cruelty and brutality. But we must remember not just the depths to which humans might sink, but also the heights to which they may aspire. That October day in Beirut saw men reach heroic heights. Indeed, heights of physical endurance and courage, to be sure, but heights of sacrifice, of compassion, of kindness, and of simple human decency as well. And even if the admission might bring a blush to the cheeks of a few of the Marines, heights of love. Long ago, the rabbis offered one interpretation of the biblical verse which tells us that we're created in the image of God. It does not refer to physical likeness, they explained, but to spiritual potential. We have within us the power to reflect as God's creatures the highest values of our Creator. As God is forgiving and merciful, so can we be. As He is caring and kind, so must we strive to be. As He is filled with love, so must we be. Because of the actions I witnessed during that hell in Beirut, I glimpsed at least a fleeting image of heaven. For in the hearts and hands of men who chose to act as brothers, I glimpsed God's hand as well. I did not stand alone to face a world forsaken by God. I felt I was part of one created with infinite care and wonderful, awesome potential. We live in a world where it's not hard to find cause for despair. The chaplain has the challenge to bring to those who often see terror at its worst some reason for hope. We need to keep faith and to keep searching, even in the worst of times. Only then may we find strength enough to keep believing that the best of times might still be. These were the words of Lieutenant Commander Resnicoff. I read them because I just felt that all of us, and I know how much you do of this, let us strive to live up to the vision of faith that Chaplain Resnicoff saw that day, and let us never stop praying and working for peace. Thank God, and thank you, and God bless you all.
So some people get their words quoted by rabbis. I've seen some rabbis stand in front of Congress and give invocations, benedictions, but your words are quoted by the president in front of a Baptist convention. How did it get to that?
Well, 4 days after the attack, a small vice presidential team came to Beirut led by George H.W. Bush, who then was vice president, and I'll tell a little later why I was in Beirut when the attack happened, but because I was, one of the admirals who accompanied the White House group was the admiral of the Sixth Fleet, and I was on his staff. So he introduced me to President Bush, and President Bush asked me, after my mind cleared, would I write a report and send it to the White House? And I remember asking my admiral, do I have to send it through the chain of command? You know, I was a little lieutenant commander. To get to the White House, it would go through 100 people. And he said, no, if the vice president invited you to do it, just send it. And the vice president had told me, put it in an envelope with a note on top saying, I'm being sent at the request of Vice President Bush. And I got a letter back a few weeks later from President Reagan, and it said, thank you for your deeds, thank you for your words, I hope you won't mind if I share them with others. So I showed the letter to my admiral, and he said that means he's going to let Nancy read them. So we all laughed, and then about a month later we got the video from the White House, and he was the keynote speaker at the Jerry Falwell Convention, Fundamentalism 84, and people at the White House told me he just put aside the speech that he was going to give and just read my entire report. So this is the end, but it's about 20 minutes, and all he does is read my report. It's really an honor.
So take us back to Beirut 39 years ago, and not just the day before, but what led you there, and then through that experience that we heard just a bit of on that video.
Yeah, it's a day, of course, I'll never forget, and so I'm particularly delighted that Rabbi Sherman invited me to speak on this day, the 39th anniversary. I was part of an experiment in the Chaplain Corps. You know, the Sixth Fleet, a lot of civilians, when you say Sixth Fleet, you think it's a number of ships, but really it's any ship that's in the Mediterranean becomes part of the Sixth Fleet, and when they leave, they become part of a different fleet. So the commander of the Sixth Fleet is the three-star admiral who's, you know, over all the ships as long as they're there, plus the Marines wherever they are, because the Marines don't always like to admit it, but they come under the Department of the Navy also. So Navy chaplains actually are the only officers who can change our uniforms depending on our assignment. I can wear a Navy uniform, a Marine uniform, or a Coast Guard uniform, depending on the assignment. By the way, the newest branch of the military is the Space Force, and so Air Force chaplains are going to treat them the way we treat the Marines. So they won't have their own chaplains, but an Air Force chaplain will treat them. So anyway, there was an experiment, a rabbi, a priest, and a minister on the staff of the commander of the Sixth Fleet, the admiral, and the ship that houses the admiral is the flagship. So we were stationed in Gaeta, Italy. And I try to make the story short because I could go hours and hours, but basically I got a call that said I have to go to Beirut. And I had been to Beirut about a dozen times, but my mother was going to visit, and so everyone knew I was taking leave, vacation, but it was the ship, and they said a Jewish Marine has been killed. At that point, it was the fifth individual in Beirut who was killed. It was a Jewish Marine, Alan Seufert from Nashua, New Hampshire. He was in a Jeep, and he got shot in the chest by a sniper. So the colonel in charge of the Marines in Beirut talked to the governor in New Hampshire, and as quickly as possible got the body on a plane out of respect for the Jewish tradition, you know, fast burial. But the rest of the Americans, there may not have been anyone else Jewish, but the rest of the Americans, out of respect for Seufert's religion, wanted a rabbi to hold a memorial service there. So they sent me from Italy there. By the way, I should say, because it was so long ago, we were there as part of a multinational peacekeeping force. There were the Americans, the French, the Italians, and the British. In the American group, there were probably 1,300, mostly Marines, but not all. So it was not easy to get to Beirut because the airport was closed because of the war. So I remember going from Gaeta to Naples on a plane to Sicily, which at that point was the center of naval aviation in the Mediterranean, from there to Cyprus, and then helicoptering in from Cyprus to Beirut. So it took so long that it was a Friday when I arrived, and so I led the memorial service, and the colonel said, tomorrow, Saturday, we'll start you back. We'll get you at least as far as Cyprus. And I said, I don't travel on Shabbat, so I'll wait till Sunday. And that's why I was there when the attack happened. You know, and many of the Christian chaplains tell that story, that it was only because of my faith that I was there when another chaplain was needed. So 6:22 in the morning, Sunday, I remember there were two buildings that we were using, about 75 yards apart. I was in the bathroom. The Marines call it latrine, the Navy call it the head, but I was brushing my teeth. I had a T-shirt on and trousers, and all of a sudden the entire building shook. The door came off the hinges. We all threw ourselves to the ground thinking we had been hit by a shell or a mortar. And I remember there were a few seconds when we were finally getting up. We were slapping each other on the back and thanking God we made it. And then we realized it was the other building that was hit, and all we had experienced was the shock blast. The FBI later did an investigation and said it was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The other building, a 4-story building, had actually been lifted up into the air and then crashed down and crumbled. It was a suicide driver. He was in a van packed with explosives under gas pressure. And so ultimately 241 Americans died, 220 Marines, 18 Navy, 3 Army. Now what made it worse, you know, if anything, if there are gradations of worseness, was that almost all of the Navy personnel were medics, what we call corpsmen, one doctor, which left us with no medical help. And we were there because Marines don't have their own medics and don't have their own chaplains. The Navy gives them. So it just seemed like forever before, you know, other medical help came. So we were literally ripping our clothes apart to wipe blood or dirt off these wounded Marines, just telling them help was on the way. And I ripped apart my T-shirt, and after that was gone, I took my kippah, and that got bloody and dirty and eventually lost in all this mayhem. And when we could catch our breath, the Catholic chaplain came up to me. George Pucciarelli was his name. And he said, in this country where every religion is gunning for every other religion, I want everyone to remember not just that chaplains helped everyone, but that a Jew and a Christian side by side. So he had put on a little purple stole around his neck as soon as we heard the explosion, because he knew he would be giving last rites. So he wanted my head covered because he had never seen me without my head covered. So he actually tore a piece of his camouflage uniform off and put it on my head. And I know we have other things to talk about, so I'll just add one thing. Now in the military, I've seen over my career tremendous advances in what we call military accommodation, religious accommodation, things people can wear. Now, not only can Jews wear kippot, Sikhs can wear turbans, Chabad rabbis now serve as chaplains with beards, but back then it was very, very different. There was a religious apparel amendment before Congress to allow kippot in uniform, and 2 years in a row it had failed. That story about the Catholic chaplain making a camouflage kippah for me was read into the congressional record in the Senate and the House, and the senator and the representative who had been fighting for that said it was because of that story that the bill finally passed. And that was the beginning of all the new regulations about religious accommodation in the military.
So at 6:22 a.m. on that day, you're always a rabbi, but what did it mean to be a chaplain in the military at that moment? how many other Jews were part of the U.S. Marines? Was it only that young man who you were there to do the memorial for? And how did your either role change as a chaplain, or did you use, if you wish, our rabbinic education to be a rabbi in that moment for other faiths?
Well, I think I'm still not sure if anybody else was Jewish, because the difference in the chaplaincy in America between our chaplaincy and most other countries is that many, many other countries, the chaplain only deals with people of their own religion, or at least just religious people. In America, in our chaplaincy, we say we have three responsibilities. Minister to your own, which means I'm always a rabbi to Jews. Facilitate ministry to others, which means I don't hold a Catholic service or a Muslim service, but if I'm a senior chaplain, it's my job to make sure those services are held, someone holds them, and care for all. And that means, regardless of whether someone has religion or not, I'm responsible for caring for them. As an aside, in the American military, a lot of civilians don't know this, the only person in the military who has 100% privileged communication is the chaplain, more than the psychiatrist, more than the lawyer. So many military personnel who are not religious at all will still go to the chaplain if they want to get something off their chest. I remember when it was not allowed to have gays in the military, the chaplains were the only ones who really knew who was gays. If someone were using drugs, they would tell me. I remember distinctly someone who told me he was going to run away the next day, probably partly as a call for help to have me talk him out of it, but also so I could say, if you do run away, here's my phone number, keep in touch with me, call me directly. So chaplains, that's the mode I went into, the care for all mode. Now I'll say one interesting thing. Chaplains have to be ordained, or the equivalent of ordination for religions that don't use that word, before they can apply to be a chaplain. But then they go through a military chaplain school. The Army, the Navy, and the Air Force have separate ones. But that's to learn about the military, how to wear a uniform, how to work with the agencies like the Red Cross or the psychologists. But we also learn from each other, what should we do in a terrible situation? So one of the things we did in the class, somebody pretended to be wounded, and the other chaplains would take turns going to him as if it were a battlefield. So if it were someone Jewish, in the class, we'd have the Catholic chaplain go. If it was someone Catholic, they'd send me. And so the question was, if a person, should I, the priest used to say, if you're willing to say the Trinity, give last rites, because it's the words that are important. If you're uncomfortable in doing that, just ask the person to look up to God, confess sins, and ask for forgiveness. The interesting thing about my time in Beirut was, of all the people that I comforted, hugged, talked to, nobody ever brought up religion. They said, if I die, tell my mother I loved her. Most of them were too young to be married, and so they would give me messages, for their family. So it was a human connection, but they knew I was a chaplain, and that's what was important.
And so maybe take us down your road to not just chaplaincy, but first to be a rabbi, because I know we're going to take a little tour around the world right now. First to Gorbachev, Reagan, and also to the rivers of Vietnam. How did those experiences shape? I'm a rabbi's kid, I'm a rabbi, and the path was sort of simple. Even my colleagues, not many entered the field that you are in. And so how does somebody going through the conservative movement in this country end up in the places that you were?
Well, again, it's very interesting because I'm a descendant of rabbis. My grandfather was a rabbi in Russia who escaped to America when my father was 3 years old. So my father was president of the synagogue, but we were never really observant when it came to rituals. And I remember we would go in the summer and visit my grandfather in Brooklyn, and he never learned English. He spoke Yiddish and Russian, and he wrote many, many books in Hebrew. So he was not my inspiration to be a rabbi, because I thought you had to be born with a long beard and speak Yiddish and be so old to be a rabbi, so I never considered I could be one. And but my father was very fiercely proud to be American, because my father told me, every time he led services, he would end with thanking God they had made it to America and that there was an America that they could make it to. So my father was not career military, but he quit his job the day after Pearl Harbor. I remember that story, because I heard it many times, that he was a lawyer. The day after Pearl Harbor, he quit. He went to the recruiter, and the recruiter said, well, we have a school for military lawyers in 3 months. He said, you don't understand. I quit my job. I want to go now. So they said, well, we can take you in as an enlisted man, not an officer, not a lawyer. So that's what he did. And he had a very hard time in World War II, but he was proud that he went. I'll also say this is just an interesting thing because of humanity. I'm so interested in human stories of the military. He purposely chose the Navy because he didn't want to shirk the responsibility of fighting and even killing when it meant, fighting Hitler and fighting in World War II, but he himself just couldn't see himself holding a gun or shooting it. So he thought by joining the Navy and being on a ship, he would have the responsibility everybody would have when the guns blast, but he wouldn't himself have to do that. So anyway, my father, I was the oldest of 3 sons, 3 boys. So my father raised me with the idea that when the time came, I would serve one assignment and kind of continue to pay our dues to America. So when I went to college, I joined NROTC, so at least I would finish college and go in as an officer, and I went straight to the rivers of Vietnam. And I was part of something called Operation Game Warden. We had to keep the rivers free from Viet Cong infiltrators. As a matter of fact, May 12th, 1970, when President Nixon ordered us into Cambodia, my ship was the first into Cambodia, and it's very possible that I was the only Jew in the Navy that was in the rivers of Cambodia. I'm never sure of that, but there weren't many of us. And so we didn't have enough people on my ship to have our own chaplain, so there was a circuit riding chaplain for the Mekong Delta, happened to be an Episcopal priest. Les Westling was his name. He passed away a few years ago. And in the military, chaplains have what we call lay leaders, so that a chaplain of one religion would have appointed sailors or officers of other religions to communicate with them what they need when a holiday is coming, how to handle different things. So he made me the Jewish lay leader, not just for my ship, but for the Mekong Delta. And I started corresponding, being in touch. I was a communications officer, so it was easy for me to use the radio to talk to other ships. And we became such good friends that he finally nudged me to think about becoming a rabbi. So after Vietnam, I still had 2 years left of obligated service. I took a test for naval intelligence, and I was with naval intelligence in Europe, but I was in correspondence with Jewish Theological Seminary. And as a matter of fact, when I went for my interview at Jewish Theological Seminary, they told me I was the first applicant to rabbinical school who, in my packet, I didn't have any letter from a rabbi saying what a nice Jewish boy I was. Instead, I had a letter from an Episcopal priest saying what a nice Jewish boy I was. And I'll add one quick other thing. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel purposely asked to be on my interview committee, and the reason was, as all of you probably know, he was very close friends with Martin Luther King Jr., and people know they stood together and marched together in Selma, but also Martin Luther King Jr. was very much against the Vietnam War, and so Heschel stood by him for that also. but admitted to me he had never met anyone Jewish who had been in Vietnam. And that's the reason he wanted to be on my committee, and then afterwards we had coffee. And I remember the question that Heschel asked me on my interview committee. Who forgets a question from Abraham Joshua Heschel? He said, I see from your record you have a good secular education, but you never went to yeshiva, you never studied Gemara. Isn't it daunting to you, I don't think anyone has ever used that word daunting except Heschel to me, to study Talmud at your age? So I was young, I was a Navy officer. I was probably a little too glib, but I said it can't be more complicated than Navy regulations. So he liked that answer.
Actually, my next question, because many of us in this country know more Jews who serve in the IDF than they do in this country. And so in today's military, there were probably actually even less Jews than maybe in the time when you started. And you told me this as a child that I'll never forget. You said even if there wasn't one Jew in the U.S. military, the importance of having a rabbi as a chaplain is still there. And so what does that look like today? What do Jewish chaplains look like today? Has that role changed? And what you said in the video of B'Tselem Elohim, which of course is perfect because you read in the Torah yesterday of Breshit, being in the image of God, and you just said focusing on the story of humanity. Is it a particular or is it a universal job?
I think, like so many answers to questions, my answer is that it's both. I think that, I remember realizing at one point that what I shared when I was at Rabbi Sherman's father's synagogue is that many times people would ask me when they find out I'm a rabbi, how many Jews are in the military? And I realized they were thinking that I only worked with Jews. And of course, that's not the case. And that's when I realized that even if there were no Jews in the military, when the admiral or the general and his staff would discuss issues of war and peace, right and wrong, I wanted a Jewish voice at the table. And many times the rabbi becomes that Jewish voice. I remember the highest assignment I ever had was I was the command chaplain for the European Command. A lot of civilians, you may know this, but a lot of civilians don't, when they hear on the radio or the television, European Command, Central Command, they're really not sure what that is. It's fascinating, the kind of restructuring of the military after World War II. Sometimes I like to ask students, if an order goes out of the White House to move an aircraft carrier or send a battalion of soldiers, who does the order go through? And almost everybody starts saying Secretary of the Navy or Chief of Staff, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all those answers are wrong. The President and the Secretary of Defense together are something we call the National Command Authorities, NCA. The order goes out from them to one of about a dozen combatant commands. European Command, Central Command, Pacific, or now it's called Indo-Pacific Command. Some of those commands are geographical, some are not geographical. So for instance, there's the new Space Command, there's a Cyber Command, a Transportation Command, and they're always headed by a 4-star admiral or general who's over all the branches of the military in that area. So for instance, for any ship or marine in the Sixth Fleet, the order would go out from the White House to the European Command. My boss was General Wesley Clark, and he was then over the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard in that whole area. When I was there, by the way, that was all of Europe and most of Africa. Now there's a new African command, but at that point it was something like 93 countries, millions of square miles, and I was the chaplain over all the forces of all faiths, all branches of the military, and then of course under me there were chaplains going down. So very, very important to understand the structure and how we care for all.
And so obviously being a rabbi, we're talking about caring for all, but we also have the connection to the homeland of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. You served in the U.S. military, but had unique experiences in the state of Israel. Some specifically, I would love to hear about the Kotel moment, where probably the only service where actually men and women prayed together, which we hope one day will happen soon again. But how does Israel fit into this whole piece for you personally and also as a U.S. military chaplain?
It's very interesting. When I was in the Sixth Fleet, and when the Beirut war was going on, we went in with the multinational force because of the chaos in Lebanon, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, Bashir Gamaliel had been assassinated, the country was falling apart. And so we went in, and during that time, we, America, tried to be as neutral as possible when it came to both Lebanon and Israel. So we were not sending any ships into Israel. Instead, we had ships off the coast of Lebanon. After the attack, which is the anniversary today, in 1983, the American military and government said, the heck with neutrality. And we started pouring ships into Israel. And one of the first ships that went in was my admiral's flagship, the Admiral of the Sixth Fleet. And when I went in, it caused quite a stir that people saw the Ten Commandments on my uniform. I was in all the papers, I was on TV interview shows. It was very, very impressive. And the Misrata Datot, the Ministry of Religion, wanted to do something special for us. So the head of that ministry arranged for me to lead a service for the Sixth Fleet at the Kotel. And it was in Jerusalem Post and a lot of the Israeli articles, and the reporters asked, is this going to be allowed for other conservative rabbis? And they said, absolutely not. This is one-time Sixth Fleet. So that was a great honor for me. And then it happened to be during our visit the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And so I was invited to lead a service in the presidential residence. Herzog was president, and Mrs. Herzog hosted the ceremony. And I still remember, you never forget certain things. So I still remember the verse I quoted. I quoted Joseph's brothers when Joseph was approaching, and they said, behold, the dreamer approaches, let's slay him and see what becomes of his dreams. And I linked that to King and said, for time immemorial, people have thought they could kill a dream by killing a dreamer. It doesn't work.
Veterans Day is coming up. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. Racism is on the rise. What's the message to our young people today about and by the way, Veterans Memorial Cemetery right down the street here? What's the message to our young people about what Veterans Day means in this country of America in 2022?
Well, over history, and of course during the time that my father was in World War II, there certainly was anti-Semitism, racism in the military. We're always partially a reflection of the country around us. But I would say that the military is always a little bit better, a little bit fairer, because you meet people of other colors, you meet people of other religions. Your life depends on them. I've heard so many stories, of how in the old days, someone would ask a Jew if they could see his horns because they had never met a Jew in person and they just heard these stories. And then you work together. I told one story to the students, and I think it's worth repeating. The first rabbi who was assigned directly to the Marines was Roland Gittleson, a Reform rabbi. And his eulogy after Iwo Jima, the Battle of Iwo Jima, became the most famous sermon out of all of World War II, possibly the most famous speech. But what a lot of people don't know is that the senior chaplain, who was Protestant, asked Gittleson to give the eulogy over the entire dedication of the cemetery because Gittleson was such a wonderful speaker. And some of the Christian chaplains objected because the majority of people killed were Christian, and they didn't like the idea of a rabbi. So the senior chaplain actually wanted to hold his position and told Gittleson to do it, but Gittleson said, no, this is not the time, for hostility. So many people have died. So they had 3 services, Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant, and his sermon, which a lot of people don't realize when they read it, was just over the Jewish ceremony. But the end of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, is that the other chaplains, not the ones who were against his speaking, but the ones who respected him and didn't like the idea that a rabbi was not allowed, made copies of his eulogy, sent it home. Their families in America shared it with radio stations, with newspapers. It was published, it was asked, and it was again, it became the most famous sermon of World War II. And today, we've gone beyond that. I would never be questioned if I were asked to give a sermon or a speech. So I think part of what we need to do, and the military can help, whether it's Veterans Day or other holidays, is to tell the good news stories, tell the ways we get together. For example, I don't know if you do anything here, maybe I'll plant a seed. February 3rd is annual For Chaplains Day. In World War II, everyone knew that story. Today, I guarantee most of our young people don't. It was a troop ship, an Army troop ship, that was torpedoed by a German U-boat, a submarine, February 3rd, 1943. So actually, next year will be the 80th anniversary. Most of the people on that troop ship died, but some survivors told the story. There were 4 Army chaplains on board, a rabbi, a Catholic priest, and 2 ministers. And they told the story that each of those chaplains gave up his life jacket to save someone else, and all 4 went down with the ship ministering to the wounded and the dying. Today, with all the hostility, with all the resurgent anti-Semitism, with all the hatred, we need stories like that. So I always recommend that if a synagogue and a church and a mosque maybe could get together and tell that story, at least it could remind, like I was saying at the end of the speech that President Reagan quoted, it could remind people of who we could be, of what we could be. And I think the military does it. By the way, one of the proudest things I did, if I could switch to since we're talking about Veterans Day, when I got out of Vietnam, young people today can't imagine how we were treated. Now, I was already an officer, I was a little older, but these young sailors, teenagers, had gone through hell for a year in Vietnam, and then when they came home, it wasn't that they weren't given welcome home parades, they weren't, they just weren't welcomed. And it's no surprise to me that every war, has, we used to say PTSD, today we say moral wounds. But in Vietnam, it was even worse because people couldn't tell their stories. So Jan Scruggs, an Army enlisted man, veteran, had the vision of this Vietnam Veterans Wall, which would make no statement about the war. A lot of people say it's the Vietnam War Memorial. It's not. It's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And it was built so that no matter what you thought about the war, you could come to honor the dead. And by doing that, also respect the people who served. In Vietnam, if you were against the war, you took out your hatred on the war fighters. It changed after the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I remember the next fight after that was Storm Desert Shield, and yellow ribbons started to appear on trees from the song, and we welcomed home today, if someone says, thank you for your service, it's almost commonplace. Although I told the students before, secret, that if you meet a veteran, it's always good to say thank you for your service. But if you meet a Vietnam veteran, say welcome home, because we were not welcomed home. And I'll just tell one very quick story. The weekend of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and this Veterans Day next month will be the 40th anniversary. And I'll have the honor of giving the prayer at that ceremony the way I did at the original dedication. We did not just dedicate the memorial. We had veterans come from all over the country to tell stories about Vietnam. And they're chilling. I'll just tell you one. One young Army veteran who had lost his arm in Vietnam said when he got out of the Army, he went back to college, and the first student who asked him how he lost his arm happened to be a woman student. He said, Vietnam. She said to him, serves you right, and walked away. And he said from that moment until that day, the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, he never told another person he had been in Vietnam. So that memorial changed the vision of America, I think, of the responsibility we have to support and care for our military personnel and veterans.
So one last question, then we'll open it up to some questions as well for Rabbi Resnicoff. Modern day, meaning like this past week, and actually this past year, Abraham Accords of people coming together in a way that even in my own generation couldn't even imagine. Now people just going to Israel as comfortably as they go to Dubai. But also this past week, especially the 39th anniversary today, Israel and Lebanon sort of like doing naval deals in the same place where you had these very difficult, tragic moments as a rabbinic chaplain from the United States in the Middle East. Maybe share about now looking forward from that day. Could you imagine what would have happened today in these beautiful ways? And now what would you say to the military back then of what you're seeing today?
Well, I'm always hesitant to be too celebratory, when things happen. So I always want to have hope. But since you saw President Reagan on the video, remember what he said, trust but verify when it came to Russia. So I would say the same thing, trust, but we need to verify. But it is a miracle, these maritime accords between Israel and Lebanon, because the fights within Lebanon, you couldn't tell the players without the scorecards. There were so many fights, and it rolled over and got Israel involved. And the reason, Israel went in to Lebanon is the reason ultimately the multinational force went in. So, the dreams, of things that could happen, we have to keep the dreams alive. And again, I'd say trust but verify, but celebrate. And maybe one final story before the audience, because I think when I say dreams, it reminds me, whenever there would be shelling, whenever the mortars or the shells would fall, the Marines had their assigned bunkers. I say foxholes, but I think the Marines technically call them bunkers. And so they would have a place where they knew they were supposed to go. The chaplains, we would say, had foxholes of choice. Whatever was the closest, we would jump in. And I remember two things would happen. The first, when I would jump in, somebody would say, watch your language, the chaplain is here. That was always kind of a joking way to announce it. But if the shelling continued, and it was a long time, people would start asking serious questions. And I remember the most serious question, and this relates, I think, to what we're talking about now. Some Marine asked me, Chaplain, here we are in the Mideast, where so many of the world's greatest religions were born, were created, and yet so much blood has been spilt in the name of religion. How can you explain that? And I always would say I don't have a good answer, but I'm struggling towards some answer. And one that I would say is that, I studied at the Naval War College. We studied ancient war. People didn't question when there were wars. You know, either you tried to get more territory or you lost territory. Either you got slaves or you became slaves. You know, war was just a fact of life. So compared to that, we wouldn't be asking this question, why is there war here? We ask it because we're not comparing to the past, we're comparing to the dreams of the prophets in the future. The time that nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they know war no more. They'll build, the swords will become plowshares. So that's the gift of dreaming. You know, it makes us uncomfortable because we're not there yet. Maybe we can get a little closer, a little closer, a little closer.
So I know that I'm able to sit here as a rabbi in this country because of the holy labor and work and love that you have served our country for as well. So thank you. We're going to open it up to questions if you wish. I'm just going to ask you to use your microphone so people could hear at home.
I was wondering the reaction among the chaplains and the service members when gays were allowed to serve openly in the military. There was so much politics here, but what was it like in the actual military?
Yeah, I actually became involved. There was a Jay, I forget his last name, his first name was J-E-H. Anyway, he was the lawyer for the Pentagon in charge of the investigation. They did an investigation before they decided whether to lift the Don't Ask, Don't Tell and let gays serve openly. And some chaplains were against it, and I had a reputation of speaking out in favor of letting. As a matter of fact, I quoted one Israeli at one time. I gave a speech at the Naval War College, and there was one question of whether gays should serve in the military, and they asked one Israeli general, and he said, "Why should they get out of it?" So it was just a very different way of looking at serving in the military, you know. And so I was fighting. Matter of fact, I had the honor when the day came when President Obama officially canceled the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. I gave the prayer at that ceremony. So they had a year-long investigation, and it turned out, not to the surprise of many of us, that for most enlisted and junior people, it didn't make any difference. It was the older people, you know, the older people sometimes ended up being seniors, but they just saw the world, you know, in a different way. So when the decision was made to allow gays to openly serve, it had very, very little effect, I think. And I'm very proud to say that.
How do you see our military today as far as preparedness for anything that might strike?
Yeah, you know, I have to admit, I've been retired 20 years. It's easier for me to talk about things back then, but I do keep in touch. For instance, I'm a regular lecturer for the chaplain school in the Navy. I see all the new chaplains coming through. I talk to the people who've been different places. I would say that I don't know anything that you don't know from the papers. We're having a hard time recruiting people now, all the services. The whole nature of war has changed, you know, so we're questioning whether the weapons we have are the weapons for the next war. You know, there was a saying that we always fight the last war, not the next war. On the other hand, you know, when push comes to shove, I have faith in America. I have faith in the creativity we have. One of the things we used to say when we would compare ourselves at the War College, when we'd study other militaries, was how inflexible the pilots or the officers in the Russian military were compared to us. You know, our aviators could make decisions on the spot. It wasn't, you know, all orchestrated from some central location. Knowing how we do that, and also our enlisted personnel, we give so much power to enlisted personnel compared to other countries, and Russia is one of them, where the enlisted can hardly do anything, without an officer specifically saying. So that's what's going to save us. I think our creativity. And in terms of religion in the military, starting with that religious apparel amendment that allowed kippot, I'm absolutely amazed at what people are allowed to do in the military today in terms of their religion. One of the expressions I used to use is that when I was fighting for kippot was our goal should be unity, not uniformity, and that we're united under the freedoms we have. And seeing one person with a turban, one with a kippah, one with a beard, reminds us. It's just like President Reagan quoted when I said interfaith foxholes. That makes us stronger. That makes us get to the point. So anyway, I would say basically I'm positive. Do I have time for one story? I could keep going with these stories and you're bringing back good memories. But when I was first a chaplain, I could wear a kippah. But the question was, could a sailor, could an officer who was not a chaplain? Today the answer is almost always yes. At that point, it wasn't a hard no. It wasn't impossible, but it was always a struggle. So you had to use psychology, and a chaplain has to be a master of psychology. I remember Yokosuka, Japan was my first chaplain assignment after I was ordained. And a young sailor came in from a ship and said, "Chaplain, I'm not very religious, but I'm engaged to a girl who actually was going to JTS, and she wants me to be more religious. And one of the things she would like me to do is start to wear a kippah." So, but he said, "I'm afraid. So, I'll get in trouble." So I said to him, "I have an idea." I looked through my drawer. I found an old Moroccan yarmulke, embroidered, colorful, souvenir that I had. And I said, "When you get back to your ship and you take off your Navy uniform hat, put this on." And he said, "Chaplain, that's going to make it 100 times worse." So I said those famous words, "Trust me." So I said, "I'm not just a rabbi. I know the Navy. I'm an officer." So he went back to his ship. Probably it was just minutes after he took his hat off and put this on, I got a call from the commanding officer. And the commanding officer said, "Rabbi, we have a little problem. Could you come to my ship?" So I said, "Yes, sir." I went right to the ship. I sat down. And again, I remember, when I tell the stories, I remember it as if it were yesterday. The captain said to me, "Rabbi, I respect religion as much as any man," and he used a non-gender sensitive term that we don't use anymore, but he said, "I respect religion as much as anyone in this man's Navy. But," he said, "there's no way Seaman Schwartz is going to wear that beanie on my ship." So I looked at him, showed respect, because I had respect for him, and I said, "Captain, what if I could convince him just to wear a little black one like this?" And he said, "If you can do that, no problem, no problem." But of course, if he had gone back with that on his head to begin with, it would have been a very different discussion. So a lot of my job was to put things in perspective at the same time as I was fighting for people's rights.
I don't know if this is the correct venue for this question, but you mentioned the maritime accord between Lebanon and Israel. And I've read articles on both sides that some people say it's the best thing that Israel has done. And on the other side, they say Israel gave everything away by doing that. What's your take on that accord?
Yeah, I would say I'm not sure. I think that I believe that every step forward is important. As a matter of fact, since we just celebrated Sukkot, I always like to use the example that, a perfect sukkah is supposed to have 4 walls. But if you can't have 4, 3 is okay. If you can't have 3, 2.5 is okay. So, maybe this is the 2.5 wall accord, maybe, but it's better than no sukkah at all, no attempt at all. hopeful, but again, I'll say trust but verify.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and learn about this. So the other day I was at a business dinner, and one of the gentlemen sitting across from me just blatantly decided to proclaim not only his atheist creed, but also how stupid he was to believe in religion, period. And, I responded by saying, actually, there's more religion in the world than there's ever been. People have religion over sports, over, their nations, over their favorite celebrity, and so on and so on. And that sort of took him a little step back. But as I reflected on that interaction, I was reminded more of the first commandment. You should have no other God before me. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about the state of religion in today's world and how our faith intermingles with that and wrestles with that.
Before I answer, I want to say this gentleman has a Dartmouth hat and his son has a Dartmouth sweatshirt, and I went to Dartmouth. So I was hoping you would ask some question. So I would say that we're at a time in the Christian world where they call it post-denominationalist list. That it used to be, many of my Christian friends would say, if they were in the mood for a fiery sermon, they'd go to a Baptist. They always went to their own church. But today, if they're in the mood for a good sermon, they go to Baptist. If they're in the mood for good music, they go to something else. So what
do they go to the synagogue for? The food?
So the same kind of thing. I think if someone fell in love with you and the sermons here and the activity here, it wouldn't so much matter if they consider themselves Reform or Conservative or Orthodox. They're part of the Jewish community. And I think many of us are at the point where people are saying they're spiritual, maybe not specifically religious, but then we have to remind them, of what religion means. I've had people come up to me, and it's almost like they're guilty. They have to say to me as a rabbi, I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious. And I say to them, what do you mean by that? Maybe I keep kosher more than you do, but maybe you honor your father and your mother more than I do. Maybe I'm better when it comes to Shabbat, but you're better when it comes to tzedakah, righteousness, charity. So religion is all of those things. So I think partially it's a branding issue. We've convinced people they're religious or not religious, depending on whether they do these commandments, not the broader idea of being a human being and working in the image of God, making this a better world.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.